Joining us with more on this conclusion of the Iranian election is Seema Sahir Zarehi, a journalist at Sharvan Publications. And thank you for taking time to speak with us today, Seema.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, first and foremost, we've got a new president now in Iran. More than likely, the election seems to be heading in that direction, and most reports are naming him, Hassan Rouhani, as the president. We don't know a lot about this man, so is there any expectation that the rhetoric coming out of Iran will change?
Well, I think certainly the tone of the dialogue will change. Whether the substance will be radically different, that is, I think, an expectation that might be a little bit too high. Even under the best of circumstances, if the Iranian election was free and democratic, the role of the presidency under the Guardian Council is extremely limited. So we could see some powers within the presidency in terms of the influence that the president can have in his dialogue with the supreme leader, Khamenei, as well as the work that he can do in terms of the economic situation internally in Iran. So I think under Rouhani, which currently, we've heard reports that the election results have been finalized, and he's received a majority of the votes. We can see some change in terms of tone and in terms of the mannerism of the dialogue and his approach to diplomatic relations with the rest of the world, but I'm not sure that we're going to substantially see a different kind of Islamic regime.
Now, back in 2008, the last presidential election, the outcome was disrupted by, obviously, violence in the streets. Now, with the list of candidates that was put forth by the Supreme Council, it's unlikely that that will happen. Is that your expectation as well?
Absolutely. The 2009 election had an extremely different feel to it than what we're seeing right now. Reports are coming in from Tehran from multiple sources that people are gathering in the streets, but the gathering on the streets today following the election results are very different from the gathering of the streets that happened in 2009 when people were feeling a sense of outrage and a sense of betrayal. There's very limited spaces in Iran for people to engage in the democratic process, to be able to raise their voice, to be able to say something about the human rights violations that the country has been subjecting predominantly on its own internal population. And this election has been one opportunity for people to raise their voice and to say, we're participating in this process as a way to say no to the Islamic regime's human rights abuses, as a way of saying no to the way that this regime has been subjecting us to so much pressure internally.
Because the candidates in this presidential election, as in previous ones, have basically been handpicked by the Supreme Council, more than likely by the Supreme Leader himself. How can external factors look at this and say that the democratic process is actually making headway in Iran?
I'm not sure that we can look at this as in any way in the same context as any kind of free or democratic election. In many ways, the election in Iran is much more of a selection between, as you said, candidates that have been highly vetted by the Guardian Council. However, that doesn't mean that people who are not using this small little opportunity as a way to raise their voice, as a way to alert the regime to the fact that they're disgruntled with the way things are going and that they want to see substantial changes, at least in terms of what's happening on the ground domestically.
Let's talk a bit about that, Seema. You're here in Canada, but you have connections to Iran, direct family connections. First and foremost, what do expat Iranians feel about the election?
I think there's a lot of different perspectives from Iranian Canadians about the election process. There's many people who are vehemently against participating in an election process in any way. They think a vote in the election process is a vote for the legitimacy of the Islamic regime, and that's a perspective that has been shared by many, many Iranian Canadians and Iranian Americans and other Iranians across the globe. There's other people who feel that even a small way to make an impact in terms of what's happening internally in Iran is worth pursuing. So there's young and old people who are encouraging each other to participate in the election, to vote in some way for whatever is the most moderate of candidates as a way to make some small changes. And then there's other people who are encouraging each other to participate in the electoral process as a way of signaling discontent. So by spoiling ballots, by writing messages around support and freedom for political prisoners, people like Saeed Malikpour from Canada, who's still lingering in jail. So this is an opportunity to bring those names up, to raise issues around human rights violations, and to let the government know that even small opportunities for signaling dissent will not be let go. So there's a lot of different kinds of perspective, and I think all of these perspectives are important, and they're part of the rich tapestry of dialogue that is needed for us to engage in, to think about what needs to happen for the future of Iran. Last question for you, Seema. I'm going to have to ask you to be brief because we're running out of time, but I think it's an important question. That's a perspective from Iranians who are living in Canada and other parts of the world. But for the people living in Iran, they are actually voting in this election. Why even bother to vote if you know that at the end of the day, the president really has no power? I think, as I said, there is some powers that the president has in Iran, even though those are limited, particularly in light of the economic situations in the country that have been extremely devastating, as well as the conditions in terms of day-to-day life. So some people feel if there is a small change that they can make, then they're going to take that opportunity. But to be honest, there's been people from Iran who's been talking about not voting as well, and been tweeting about that and speaking to foreign media about the fact that they refuse to engage in the electoral process. Seema, I appreciate your thoughts, and thanks for coming down here today. Thank you so much for having me. Our pleasure. That was Seema Sahir Zarehi, a journalist with Sharvan Publications.